And so these are the things that the Crusaders set out with, the goals that they're trying to achieve. People volunteered by the thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands, to go on these crusades. Why? There appear to have been a couple of different reasons why people decide to go on these crusades. Some of them hoped that by going to these lands, they would be able to gain fortune. And that they would, in their plundering of the enemy, they would make wealth for themselves and then go back to their homes with all this wealth. So you have all people in the poor classes thinking that, wow, this is the opportunity for me to get ahead, right? And so I can gain a lot of money. For some, it was probably just the idea of adventure, going out, seeing new lands, engaging in these great quests to defeat the enemy. Others probably did it to broaden their ambitions or achieve their ambitions. Right? Nobles or lords who saw this as an attempt for power, and particularly that as these Muslim lands are taken from them, somebody's got to fill that power void. Why not me? Why not me as a ruler over a city or over a region? Some probably went just because they hated Muslims. And so the opportunity to defeat the Turks was an appealing thing. However, for some people, it was probably a matter of devotion. That they went on these crusades firmly believing that that's what Jesus wanted them to do. And that they had given themselves fully to Jesus and believed that as the leaders told them that this was God's will, they did it from motives that this was a service to God that they were performing. All told, there were 8 crusades. There were other efforts that go to the Middle East during this time. Not all of them were crusades. The difference had to do with the papal approval of it. And so the Pope approved 8 of those crusades. We're not going to talk about all 8 of them. We're only going to talk about a few of them, and even then, just highlights. For the first crusade, thousands go because of the possibilities. Others claimed that they had received signs or seen visions. In October of 1097, for example, many claimed that they had seen a comet with a cross-shaped tail as they were making their way. Right? The idea being, oh, we've seen a cross in the sky. This must indicate that God is favoring our trip. Most of the people who are going during this time are common people who often left to go to this event, to go to this battle without any sort of organization. It's just thousands of people heading out towards Jerusalem. For example, in 1097, 15,000 people arrive in Jerusalem, and it's estimated that 90% of them are not knights. Right? So these are not people that have any sort of training or skill in warfare. There's the case of a man named Peter the Hermit. A lot of what we know of Peter the Hermit is legendary, but it does reflect some of the things that were taking place. Peter claimed that Jesus had appeared to him in Jerusalem and encouraged him to be a part of this. He gathered a group in France, most of them peasants, and as they travel to Jerusalem, they are devouring people's crops as they travel. They get into battles with other Christians. Right? There's no discipline here as a military force. In fact, a lot of the people they got in conflict with were other Christians and Jews. They killed many Jews in their travels. Most of this group, once it makes its way to Palestine, loses their lives when they are killed by Saracens, a name that was used for Muslims at the time. It was derived from a place name for Arabia. The Byzantine emperor is not particularly impressed with this army. It includes groups like this one under Peter the Hermit. What am I supposed to do with these people? Right? Eventually he will require them to give a loyalty oath to the emperor to make sure that they are going to fight for the causes that he wants to be involved in. Eventually the major force will reach Antioch of Syria. They decide to lay siege to it, which essentially was meant to cut off the supplies, with the hope that once the supplies are gone, once the food's gone, the water's gone, the city will surrender without a fight. However, in this case, those that were inside the city had more supplies than those that were laying siege, and so they can just outlast them. But an Armenian Christian supposedly opened the gate, allowing the Crusaders in. There was 4 days of battle inside the city. In accordance with all this issue of the religiosity and the visions and signs, a man named Peter Bartholomew has a vision that the Holy Lance, right, the spear that pierced Christ's side, is in the city. And so they must discover this lance, and when they discover this lance, they will win. Well, they find it. They find it so much that even some of the Crusaders doubt this, right? I mean, these are people kind of attuned to these supernatural findings, but when this is found, people say, I don't think that's it. But this desire for religious relics and power attached to religious objects. It does, or at least does occur during the time where the Crusaders eventually rally and beat the Turks. They decide to make their way now to Jerusalem. On their way, they are singing, they are chanting. On June the 6th of 1099, they take Bethlehem. On June the 7th, they reach Jerusalem. But the people inside Jerusalem are Arabs, not Turks. So yes, they're Muslims, but I mean, so much of this has been the Turks, the Turks, the Turks. These are Arabs. And they know the Crusaders are coming. So they prepare for a long siege. Any of the lands around the city of Jerusalem are raised. Water in wells are poisoned so that the Crusaders can't live off the land. Christians in Jerusalem are driven out, and the Muslims send for reinforcements from Egypt. When the siege occurs, there's 5 weeks that the siege takes. The Crusaders hear of this call for reinforcements, and they decide, we have to take the city of Jerusalem before that happens. Eventually they overrun the outer defense, but they cannot get past the inner wall. Quarrels break out between the leaders. Eventually, though, again according to the story, a knight finds a break in the wall, and eventually the group is able to get in. Jerusalem is recaptured in the summer of 1099. There's violence, there's atrocities on both sides. Often in the Western history version of this, it's only focused on the atrocities of Muslims, but there was a lot of violence and atrocity by the Crusaders as well. All the defenders of Jerusalem are killed, the women are raped, Jews were killed, babies were thrown against the walls. When the army from Egypt arrives, it is handily defeated. Eventually, several Crusader states are developed, regions controlled by these Christian Crusaders. It becomes an opportunity for personal power, which sidetracks some from the goals of the crusade. Eventually, one leader is established as the King of Jerusalem, as well. The First Crusade is the one that is the most successful out of the 8. In fact, most of the Crusades result in either disasters or failure after this. But despite the relative success, there's a lot of things that don't always go as what they would like to have been. The East, for example, still doesn't feel close to the West because they didn't get the help that they needed. Right? They get this ragtag bunch of peasants in the army that don't really help them like they would like. Another result, though, was an increase of people going to the Holy Land, looking for relics, looking to go visit these sites as they once did. Third, the establishment of a variety of orders of knights that have kind of both a military function and a religious function, or bathe their military function in religiosity. Groups like the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers, people who were meant to protect or help the pilgrims as they travel. For those individuals, those Christians who had been under Muslim rule, it was freedom. It meant freedom. It resulted in freedom. Often these people had also had problems under Byzantine rule, and so now this was more freedom than they had even before Muslim control. Jews did not fare well under the Crusades, even though they are not the target of the Crusades. They are just innocent bystanders in a sense. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism that gets talked about. There's Jews that get attacked physically. Although it did not bring East and West together, it did bring the West together more than it had been before. So that unity between East and West didn't result, but the Western Europe becomes more unified. Ultimately, though, of course, it begins a deterioration of any sort of relationships that were relatively positive between Christians and Muslims. And in some ways, we could say that a lot of the tension that we still see in our culture is, the Crusades are still, the results of the Crusades are still being felt in some areas. Over the next 100 years, the Crusader states would fall. New crusades were organized to try and recapture them. As I mentioned before, they failed. One of the independent Crusader states fell, calling for the Second Crusade, this need for an army of relief for Jerusalem, led by this time kings and nobles. 200,000 people left to go on the crusade. However, the ambitions of several of these people resulted in losses of people in Asia Minor, and then also losses before they even got to the region. And rivalries among the Crusaders also led to difficulties as well. Jerusalem eventually fell back to Muslim control in 1187 to an Islamic ruler named Saladin. European rulers, including Richard the Lionhearted, attempted to negotiate with Muslims, but they failed. And even Richard was captured and held for ransom for a time. And that's kind of the Third Crusade. The action of the Crusaders also disrupted the Byzantines sometimes and disturbed the Byzantines. So, here they are calling for help, and often the Crusaders were not helpful against the Muslims and were even harmful to the Byzantines. In the Fourth Crusade, for example, the city of Constantinople was pillaged by the Crusaders. Eventually, the Crusaders replaced the Patriarch of Constantinople with one from the West who forced the Byzantines to observe Latin rituals. And so they've been doing things so long for the Orthodox way, they were now forced to do things the Catholic way. Several times, children participated in crusades. And so people will talk about children's crusades. Now, it's unclear whether in these so-called children's crusades, it doesn't appear that they were undertaken primarily by children. It appears in many cases that children were a part of it. There's very few sources, very little information about some of these things. But the most famous of these children crusades supposedly happened in the year 1212. One version of the tale was that a 12-year-old shepherd boy named Stephen appeared in France with a letter from Christ to King Philip of France. Stephen was going to lead a group of children to the Middle East to convert peacefully the Muslims. He claimed that a variety of miracles was going to accompany them as they traveled to the Middle East. And a group numbering around 30,000 supposedly came together, thousands of children from France and the Netherlands. It may, however, have been simply wandering peasants rather than children. The Latin words that are used in these sources that talk about it could be translated in other ways, but eventually the myth of these children's crusades developed. Supposedly some of those travelers turned back and no miracles took place. Some of them died, some of them were sold into slavery. Whatever happened, it was never officially a crusade. The Pope, Innocent III, appears to have encouraged the group to return to their home and not go on this journey. What questions do you have? What do we need to clarify? All right, we will end there and pick up with some things related to culture and society.